Joining us now is hostage negotiator Scott Walker. Welcome, Scott. You're watching these events unfold. We just saw the Thai hostages, the existence of whom most of us were unaware until a few minutes ago, but they seem to have crossed the border out of Gaza in cars being driven across that border. And we hope very soon that the 13 Israeli hostages who were promised will be released will indeed be released. But as an experienced negotiator in these situations, I'm assuming that these final moments before the handovers, these are the tensest moments.
Yes, in the whole of the negotiation process, this is probably one of the most dangerous, stressful, fragile moments of the whole process, because if things can go wrong, they're likely to go wrong at this point. So many things could still go wrong, which is why the time spent in going through the logistics, the sequencing, the practical aspects is time well spent.
I mean, Scott, for a layman watching this, it's quite hard to understand or put yourself into a position of the sort of conditions and demands that would have to be met to get to the point that an exchange is able to happen. Do you have any insights you can give us into the sort of discussions that originally sort of seemed to fall apart when we had that 24-hour delay?
Well, I'm not privy to the exact negotiations that are going on, and even if I was, I wouldn't obviously be explaining it here. But in terms of how it normally works is these delays are because both sides need to sign off essentially what is going to happen, when, how, so there are no violations, there's no inadvertent mistakes. Because in this situation, both sides are still keeping their fingers on the trigger, so to speak. And there's some factions here, any excuse needed to actually thwart this ceasefire process.
Scott, we keep talking about negotiations and this tense moment with the final furlong of these negotiations. What exactly are the negotiations? Who's involved? What are they doing? Is it by phone, by Zoom, in person? How do they unfold?
It's probably all of those. And as we've seen and heard many times, the Qataris and Egyptians and potentially the Iranians in the background have all been involved here to a certain degree, particularly the Qataris. And Hamas leadership are based in Qatar. And so there would have been some face-to-face meetings, as well as through phone and Zoom and other means at all. But the key thing here is it's really streamlining the communication process so you don't have so many people all getting involved with different kind of arguments on both sides. So it's really important to try and narrow down as finely as possible that one or couple of lines of communication.
I mean, we don't have much idea of the sort of conditions these people will have been kept in, their state of mind, their health. What we do know is that they're likely to undergo medical checkups when they get to safety. What else is likely to happen to the hostages in the next 24 hours?
Well, as you mentioned, they're going to get checked out medically because we just don't know the state they're in. We like to think they're being treated reasonably well because that is in Hamas's interest to do so. So once they've been checked out medically, been reunited with their families, there will, of course, then be a process of debriefing to find out exactly what their experience has been like. Are there any identifiable features of where they were kept and who was keeping them? But the whole care package, the whole well-being process kicks in now to really support them as they come back, because some of them will respond better than others. And so, yeah, it's a long way yet.
As I was saying, don't forget that this exchange, these releases are happening 24 hours after they were originally scheduled to happen. And we understand that the reason for this delay was the Israelis demanding proof of life. We had a security expert on yesterday, Will Geddes, who told us that, in his view, all 240 hostages down there in those tunnels will not be alive. Some of them will have died. Would you agree with him? Do you think they'll all be alive, or do you think some of them will have perished in these terrible conditions?
Well, of course, it'd be nice to say that all 240 odd are going to come out, but I think in the circumstances and in the situation we find ourselves in and what's happened over the last few weeks, it's probably unlikely all of them are going to come out alive. And going back to your point you made about the proof of life, in every case I've been involved in, it's standard procedure where before the very final steps of the agreement, you want to get that proof of life to make sure the hostages are alive and well before you finalise anything.
I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about the balance of this particular deal, the balance of this truth, and Hamas essentially eking out as much as they can the short sort of time-dependent release of tranches of hostages here and there in exchange for more and more ceasefire, more and more truce, and including a surveillance blackout. I mean, is this particularly onerous and heavy-handed negotiation? Is this, in essence, a bad deal for Israel?
Well, it's whatever Israel and Hamas agreed is. And I don't mean to be flippant there, but in terms of if this is the price that Israel are willing to pay, and likewise with Hamas and their conditions, then that's a good deal if both of them are going to agree to it. And I think it's easy to sit here on the sidelines and going, well, that's a good or bad deal. But it's whatever each side are willing and able to go along with.
Scott, you've been involved in these kind of negotiations in the past. Give us some kind of idea of the state of these hostages as they're released. I mean, we were talking earlier, some of them are kids, and the trauma they've been through will probably affect them for the rest of their lives. There are women, there are mothers, there are babies. When they are released, hostages in these circumstances, what kind of condition do they tend to be in?
As I said, some of them have handled the whole time in incarceration reasonably well. And there's others who really struggle, which is why each of them will be treated according to their needs and what they need for them to be reintegrated, so to speak, into society. And it's going to take time. And there are lots of support services and agencies out there who directly support hostages when they're released. But they will need time and they will need care, and each of them will respond to it slightly different.
And would it be customary for both sides to choose to use interlocutors and intermediaries for the physical handover of the hostages? NGOs, for example, to provide potentially the transportation, to physically be the ones to accompany the hostages until they get into some sort of neutral territory?
Yes, absolutely. And what we've seen here in the previous releases as well is the International Red Cross, who have performed that role. I know there was some kind of dispute apparently yesterday as to who was going to take that interlocutor role, but it makes sense, particularly in this situation where there's zero trust between the parties, to have somebody they can trust and rely on to take hold of the hostages and then bring them to safety across the border.
And Scott, how important is the kind of post-release treatment of the hostages? To go back to the point I was making earlier, some of these hostages down there, particularly the kids I'm thinking of, they don't know that their families have been murdered, that their loved ones are now dead. They don't know that their homes have been destroyed. They don't know that their lives have been wrecked in this way. It must be very, very difficult to sort of break the news to people and then deal with them afterwards. Very traumatic times for them.
Absolutely, which is why it's crucial to have trained professionals there who can help them reintegrate.
Scott, just going to interrupt you for a second. We've got breaking news.
Yeah, we have just learnt that Israeli hostages in Gaza have been transferred to the Red Cross, and they are now making their way to the border crossing with Egypt. That is according to various Israeli TV stations. So there we have it. Israeli hostages, we don't know how many yet, in Gaza, have been transferred to the Red Cross, and they are making their way to the border crossing with Egypt.